Hi everyone, you found the Just the Right Snowboard channel. I'm Lars Horstman and this episode has been requested by many of you and I will try my best to shine some light into the world of variable and multi-radial snowboard side cuts. Quick recap for the people who are new to this channel or new to the topic. I'm going to utilize my good old cardboard example because it's been working so well. What is side cut in the first place? Side cut is that curve in the side of your board. There's a waist, the narrowest part of your board. People talk about waist width and side cut radius in the spec sheet of a board, and the radius is mostly stated in meters, so that let's just say this guy here is an 8-meter radius, and what that really means is that this curve is a very small portion of a perfect circle that has an 8-meter radius. Now this number, what that really states in regards to the ride of your board is that this number is a little bit more than the largest arc that your board can perform in a clean manner without sliding. And why is it the largest arc? This is important for this entire episode to understand. Side cut and board flex are playing together very closely. So you can imagine with this board tilted 90 degrees on edge like this basically, I got a lot of space here in the middle, right? Now my weight is gonna push the board into the snow in the center, and my edge in an ideal world, if my board flexes perfectly with my weight, is gonna be touching the snow all the way along, and this creates a curve, right? That creates an arc, and that is my turn shape, my turn radius. So basically you can imagine that this arc gets tighter and tighter the more I tilt the board on edge, and therefore the more I compress the center, right? I hope that's visible on camera from this angle. So basically that is why the number that you read in your spec sheet states something a little bit larger than your largest possible cleanly carved turn. With this piece of information in mind, you will likely quickly start asking questions, because this single radial 8-meter radius suddenly changes through the turn, right? Like all of a sudden you're going, like starting out a little larger, and then you get tighter and tighter and tighter, and you go through the fall line before you then gently set the board down again to change edges for your new turn. So this idea of single radial side cut, everything is all straightforward. Here's my 8-meter turn shape. Not quite. The board turns tighter and tighter the more you bend it, and this is happening automatically as you tilt it higher and higher on edge. So this is where manufacturers started to think of blending side cuts, blending different circles along the edge to give you slightly different feels. And you can really like fine-tune the behavior of a board by spreading, let's say, different sections, different circles across the edge. Some people have read descriptions like quadratic side cut or multi-radial side cut or variable side cut or progressive or regressive side cut. And I'm gonna try to, in the simplest manner possible, to lay out to you real quick what that actually looks like, how subtle these changes are, and then also how you may or may not notice them on the board of your choice. I thought of many different ways to demonstrate this in a very simple and easy to understand manner, and actually also to show you how subtle these changes really are. They are pretty much invisible to the eye. It takes a lot of practice to really look down a board's edge and actually see what's going on there. This episode is sponsored by IKEA. Couple household items will make this really simple. I got a couple of plates and bowls here, different sizes, and draw that out for you. Now, if you want to watch two videos that I will put into the video description here, that actually talk a bit more about the turn shape, like the riding behavior on snow, then you should watch those two by Sean Martin, the founder and owner of Doneck Snowboards. He recorded that ages ago. I think they're over a decade old. And he came up with fantastic ways to make you understand and to visualize like what's happening on snow and how a board behaves throughout a turn with exactly those dynamics that I've been talking about, like angulation and flex and all that stuff. So check out those two videos. They are in the description here. And now I'm going to stick more to how the boards look and where the manufacturers apply these changes along the edge, just so you are less confused when you're then looking at a spec sheet and you're reading variable or varying numbers in the sidecut column. Sorry about this short but very necessary interruption. The content on this platform is entirely free to you, and so far I refuse to set up any kind of subscription-based anything, like Patreon, for example. I don't like subscriptions in my own life. That kind of sucks that everything is subscription-based these days. And I want you to be able to simply tip me voluntarily if you feel like my content is helpful at all. You can do so on a platform called Buy Me a Coffee. My link there is buymeacoffee.com/justaride. Many people have helped me out there over the last season, and I'm very much hoping that we can repeat that this year. All right, let's dive deeper into the sidecut topic here, and thank you kindly. So I wrote down the most common kinds of sidecuts, and I'm going to use my second largest plate here. Basically the two lines you're seeing, that's going to be where our effective edge ends. So in this area you would normally have a nose or a tail. This is going to really easily and quickly make clear what's going on there. So here's my single radius sidecut, right? That's a clean arc, pretty straightforward. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this exact same radius, and I'm going to draw out a sidecut with tighter tips. So basically there's going to be a blend in this curve. I'm going to take a really small one here. That's going to be my smallest bowl. And of course this is a little bit hypothetical, right? Like with a computer model, you get even more subtle blends in those areas, of course. So here you go, right? When you look at this, you can already tell, oh wow, there's hardly a difference. I'm going to do the same thing here with the tighter center. Larger radii in the tips. Terrible drawing. There you go. So the changes are so subtle, and most people think there's something wild going on along their edges, and it's really not that much. And then with multi-radial one, I'm going to take a different sheet of paper. What you often see, for example, quadratic sidecut, what you see then a manufacturer do is give you some sort of thing that looks like this, and they go, oh, here's our quadratic sidecut. So basically there's an arc underlying this, right? Like here's your arc. That is really what they mean, right? Like this would be my edge, this arc, and they're saying, well, there you go, quadratic sidecut. We are blending multiple radii. Of course, this is an exaggeration, right? Now, the misconception that happened is people take this and go, oh, I get it. It's lip tech, it's magnetraction. No, it is not magnetraction. Magnetraction would be if this is your edge, and lip tech in that case go and do this, right? Like you got, well, obviously terrible drawing, but you got, boom, you got your serrated edge design with those bumps sticking out, right? Like boom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is supposed to give you better edge grip. So this and this is definitely not the same, right? Like this is something totally different. And quadratic sidecut, of course it doesn't look this dramatic, right? Like because on a computer model you can blend these overlaps, and you basically just have multiple overlap zones along your edge, and the manufacturer can do, yeah, kind of whatever they see fit for the particular board. And then we have progressive. Progressive is technically a side cut that is larger in the tip and then smaller in the tail. Here you go. Smaller plate for the tail. Oh yeah, by the way, this is my tail side. This is my nose side. A regressive would be the opposite. So here's my regressive side cut. Going larger arc into in the nose, a tighter arc. There you go. When you look at all of these lines, there's no way that you look at this and you can tell me right away which is which, right? And that's how subtle that is on your snowboard as well. So before I explain any further, to avoid any kind of fun making of this video and people getting at me for using IKEA plates to explain side cut, this is of course an oversimplification. But what I'm trying to say here is like the changes are really subtle. If you do it this dramatically as I just did, literally just butting a larger and a smaller side cut against each other, you can hardly see anything. Now imagine the manufacturer does it more sophisticatedly and actually blends that over a longer distance. Well, then you really can't see anything anymore, right? So you could say, for example, for a progressive side cut, you could quite easily engineer a curve that goes from the very nose contact point to the tail contact point and gets tighter and tighter and tighter as it goes, right? But then of course let's say it goes from an 8 meter to a 6 meter radius in the tail. The 6 meter is literally reached at the very end, right? Like, so it's you need to try to wrap your head around these things still producing one even curve, right? Like, it's not some interrupted thing, or what I said earlier that people take away from this. Okay, there's multiple radii, so of course my edge would be wavy or something, right? Like, so that's like CAD CAD drawings on a computer. You can do all kinds of things, whatever you can imagine, you can draw out on a computer, and that is how this is done. Now, the effect. Pretty straightforward, really. If you want to talk about, obviously, radial side cut, that's like the simplest thing, right? And some engineers, some board engineers, I listened to, what's his name, Michael Clifton or Christian, not sure. It's a talk with the Angry Snowboarder. It's actually a little bit older, I believe, maybe a year old, not sure. He basically says, he's the Roman battalion engineer. He says like, well, radial side cuts are kind of done, they're kind of boring, and why would you even do that? Personally, I find like it depends on the size of it. My Stranda Descender is a radial side cut at 9 meters, like a larger radius radial side cut. Overall, to me, it just feels very stable and it feels very calm. And that's what the board is supposed to do. It's supposed to be a freeride board that is very stable at high speed. So the large radius on a board that generally doesn't overturn, because what you could of course do is put the larger radius in the tips, or the tip, like the nose, to keep the nose from being twitchy and overturning, but then give me a tighter radius in the center, right? Well, you don't necessarily want that on a freeride board. Like, that's not what you're aiming for, this tight pivoty thing between your feet. So yeah, I don't know, it probably depends on many other things like board flex and then actually the number of the radius. But radial side cut is really straightforward, it's just one curve. So if you go for a radius, like for example the K2 Passport is an example with tighter tip and tail radius. What you can basically envision with boards that are designed like that is that your main feel comes from that larger center radius, and the tips simply help the board with entering turns and finishing turns. Because as I explained earlier, finish of the turn or entry of the turn and finish of the turn is when you are at the least amount of board angulation, right? So the board has the least amount of aggressive turn shape when you enter the turn and when you exit the turn. So if you ride in a technically correct manner, where your weight shifts from the turn entry on your front foot slowly onto the back foot throughout your turn, then you suddenly understand, aha, I'm activating that tighter radius on my front foot when I enter my turn with little board angulation, and I instantly get the feedback the board wants to turn due to its tight nose radius. And the same thing happens at the end of the turn when I'm on my back foot and I want to snap over to my new edge. The board gives me that little bit of extra kick, helps me to release that turn a little bit better. Yeah, because it's a little bit of a boost, right? So you can, to simplify this, you could say a board with a larger center radius and tighter tip radii is basically, let's just assume the center is fairly large, is a calm board that has a bit of turn entry and exit assistance to make it a little bit more approachable, but overall give it a pretty stable vibe due to that larger center radius. So the opposite happens when you go for a tighter radius in the middle and larger radii in the tips. What you get from that is a board that is rather stable, and I think the K2 is a great brand for these examples. They have all kinds of different things. The Antidote, as far as I remember, Sage Kotzenberg's board. That board is designed in a way with larger tip and tail radii and tighter center radius. And really, like I've tried that board. I think it's an amazing snowboard. You can really feel how the board is very, very stable, like through the entry of a turn on your front foot, because it doesn't overturn. But if you hurry up with your edge change and you tilt it on edge somewhat quickly, you get that center radius engaged like really, really quickly. And yeah, it really turns tight if you want it to. So it's a board that has, like, you could say it has great versatility, because like if you ride it in a certain way, it turns really tight, but if you don't, then you get that stability from the tips. And if you think of what the guy does, that kind of makes sense. He's riding fast a lot. He surely doesn't want a board to overturn, as in like the tips hooking up and throwing him onto a new path, onto a new track or trajectory. But he does spin, right? He spins a lot of kickers and whatnot. And that's where you like push that center, like at the takeoff, right? You compress the board, bend it into an arc, and you spin off of that. So a board with a very large center radius is probably not very very snappy at takeoffs when you initiate spins. So a board like that makes sense. Backcountry freestyle, right? Like backcountry meaning free ride, like big mountain riding. So he's got those stable tips that really help him to maintain speed without the board being twitchy. But then the center actually has some good turn, some good spin to it. So I hope that makes sense, and I'm really trying to keep that simple, because also I believe it's a subject you can quickly overinterpret that. Personally, I want to say you got to be quite an expert to tell those things apart. Like of course, if you ride a board for 2 weeks and then you ride the next one for 2 weeks, maybe you can tell it. But to jump from board to board and be able to say this board has that, this board has that, it takes a lot of experience. So don't overinterpret this, but this episode was seemingly important to many people, and I think it's a cool topic anyways. Multi-radial side cuts, this is something that I personally haven't quite understood myself. So the way I understand this, because we have technically everything is multi-radial, right? This is where I'm a little bit thrown off. And unfortunately, the snowboarding industry does not have that much good information. They like to wrap things in cool marketing terms and leave us hanging with that, rather than explaining what really happens on snow. That's quite often the case in my opinion. So multi-radial, everything here on my paper is multi-radial. The way I understand the term with quadratic side cuts and all this stuff is basically that instead of like in a progressive side cut where it gets tighter towards the tail, the side cut develops in one direction, right? Like with a multi-radial, what I am understanding is that from the center outwards, the manufacturer is blending multi different radii towards the tips, but that happens symmetrically. So let's say your center is 9 meters and then they blend into 8 and 7, then this happens to both sides equally. This is how I interpret multi-radial or quadratic side cut. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Check out the comments. Hopefully some smarter people than me are going to chime in and set this straight, but that's kind of how I understand it. And since we never know, nobody goes into the depth of telling us exactly whatever, the first foot of our edge is this radius and then it blends into that radius. It's an even curve, right? We don't really know. We can't really make that much sense of that. It is more about a feel, right? This is possibly something that is more about you just buying that board, experiencing it and deciding whether you like it or not, rather than overthinking it and overanalyzing what that really means and how you can figure out prior to buying it whether this is for you. My Stranda Shorty is a multi-radial side cut, and every board that I've ridden so far that states multi-radial side cut to me felt really smooth in regards to how it goes through the turns. Like, it's, yeah, hard to explain. Like there's like a smoothness, a roundness in that turn shape that I really appreciate. Then we get to progressive and regressive. I already stated progressive, getting tighter towards the tail. Mostly what manufacturers are aiming for, you find that a lot on those surf shapes, like heavily tapered boards quite often have a progressive side cut. I talked about this in my taper episode. I'm going to put that in the description here as well. Check out my taper episode, super interesting. Boards with a lot of taper tend to not finish turns very well across the hill. They like to get their edges changed as you come out of a turn in a diagonal line across the hill, and then bam, new edge. So lots of taper, kind of like speed more down the fall line rather than S turns. Now the way the reason why you have a lot of taper on those power boards is, of course, it makes the tail narrow so the tail can sink, and you need that for your float. Now if a manufacturer wants the float but they don't want that kind of turn behavior, what can they do? Of course, they counter the sluggish turn exit of a heavily tapered board by simply giving it a progressive side cut. So by tightening up the radius along the edge towards the tail on a board that is fairly heavily tapered, you may very well be able to counter this effect and end up with a board that does turn across the hill and come around really nicely at the end of the turn. Again, I'm going to quote my Stranda boards here since I'm very familiar with them, and I do actually talk to Mats, the designer, the shaper, and he explained these things to me, and I can tell that when I ride the boards. My Tree Surfer is one of those. The board is 15mm taper, so it's a fair amount of taper, but it is progressive side cut, and that thing just turns on a dime. It's beautiful to carve in those S turns. I don't perceive the taper in a way that I wouldn't like, because I don't really like that kind of feel, the heavy taper boards. Regressive is interesting. Regressive is a board, if you know the shaper behind Korua Shapes, that is Jerry Niedermeyer. The guy, I believe, is German, Bavarian, and he is probably a person in his 60s, has decades and decades of experience shaping race boards for F2, German race board manufacturer. So he comes from that kind of background, and regressive is basically a race side cut. And what that means is you have a tighter radius in the tip and a larger radius in the tail. Well, why could that be any good? If you consider the dynamics of tilting a board on edge that I explained early in this episode, and you consider a race course where you have gates and you need to get from gate to gate, and of course that goes down the fall line, right? Nobody is racing in the granny speed that I sometimes carve in with my nicely finished S-turns. You want to get down to the finish line. So what people need to do on a racetrack, on a race course, is turn early, as in get to the gate high, get close towards the gate in a fairly rapid direction change to then pick up speed towards the next gate and then come into that gate high again. Right, so basically that already describes that kind of sidecut design. Like you have a board that on the front foot at turn entry really changes direction somewhat quickly, but then like it mellows out and it makes you pick up speed down the fall line. Goes along the lines of what I explained about taper, right? Like the taper of the board or the larger sidecut in the tail. That's almost a similar thing. It's not the same thing by any means, but it's kind of a similar effect, this acceleration towards the end of the turn. So that's what you get out of that. Now, regressive is also super interesting for the people that like that. This is almost counterintuitive, therefore even more interesting. Regressive is also interesting for the people that like that S-turn shape and want really, really, really round shapes because they keep increasing edge angulation, like extreme carving, right? Like you really want to tilt it over all the time and lots of it. Like get your body towards the snow. Why is that a good thing? If you consider what I said earlier in the episode, you are at the least amount of edge angulation at turn entry, right? You come in, but the tight radius in the nose gets you to actually change direction pretty easily and you go towards the fall line. And from there onwards, you just crank, right? Like you tighten up the radius of your board as you go through your turn and as you move towards your back foot, you make it tighter and tighter and tighter. Now the board is designed with a radius that gets larger and larger and larger. So your action is countered by the board's design in a way, and therefore results in a round shape. This is the funny thing when you consider that the radial sidecut, the board sidecut that consists out of one single radial arc, does not give you that turn shape, because as you tilt the board higher and higher on edge, radius gets tighter and tighter, and therefore your 8 meter nice circle actually ends up in like whatever, a 4 meter circle. Damn, that was a handful. What are you left with here? Personally, I find the subject is extremely interesting, but at the same time, it is also something that can very easily be overrated. Most people out there, I want to say, would not know the difference between radius A and radius B. It takes a lot of experience, and it also takes a lot of understanding of your own riding if you made that a criteria in your board choice. So for example, this variable sidecut thing for people that really tilt the board over, yeah, I mean, like, that totally makes sense, but how many people are we talking, right? Like, in the grand scheme of things, if you consider that the average snowboarder rides 5 to 10 days a year, you can imagine that this subject, the depth of this, is quite irrelevant to most people. However, if you are one of the people that this is relevant to and you always wanted to know about it, I really hope that I could make sense of it. And in my personal opinion, the way you can go about this is fairly simple. If the numbers, if the manufacturer actually states them in the spec sheet, are really close together, you probably won't notice all that much. If the numbers, however, are very far apart, then that's easy to pick, right? Like if you have a board with a really tight center side cut and really large tip radii, well, that's pretty easy. Now that we know that the tips of the board start and finish the turn, well, guess what? That board is going to be pretty calm and is not going to be overly twitchy, although it has a pretty tight center radius. So, you know, like if you want that kind of feel, like good stability, but still be able to crank out a tight turn when needed, that's probably good design. I think for most people out there, the better design is the opposite, larger radius in the middle, tighter in the tips, because what people struggle more with is to actually get into a turn. And if your board can help you with a tighter nose radius, I want to say for most people that is something that's rather beneficial. Right, so I hope that this episode made sense. I hope that you can see the nuance in it, as in I'm not claiming that this is the science and people are using IKEA plates to design snowboards, but I think it was a very easy to understand way to wrap your head around, like where these blends actually are and how noticeable they are. And for the most part, to help you understand that multi-radial side cuts, in whichever way they come, do not mean that there's a disruption in that clean arc of your side cut. All right, cool. Hopefully I can find you here again in the next episode. Until then, happy turns. Share this with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe. I would be stoked to get a couple more subscribers over the season. And definitely make sure you watch the 2 videos in the description. They are definitely going to shine even more light into the subject. All right, take care everyone. See you out there. Bye-bye.